We were going to talk about Titans and Washington today as part of the show. Unfortunately, it got bumped like a late night guest because we got a bigger attraction here. The Carolina Panthers have fired Matt Rhule, and we got to talk about this. Inevitable, felt like we were cruising toward this as the end point. Panthers were the worst offense in the league through the first 4 weeks of the season. Can't imagine it got much better after yesterday. They could not figure out all of the most important elements of being an NFL franchise while under Matt Rhule. So it seemed like we were cruising toward this finish. This leaves them in a pretty weird spot. What was your first reaction to the Matt Rhule firing and what comes next year for Carolina?
I mean, the predictability of it is probably where we start, right? Like, I think everybody could have kind of circled this game after the way the season started as A, knowing how the result was going to be, and B, there being probably a perfect jumping off point. You know, I think that if you're looking at the situation in terms of getting your butt kicked, you start assessing where this roster is at within this regime, which is basically nowhere. The quarterback roulette that they've played, and the fact that the guy that you brought in is now nursing an ankle injury, so you're going to have to play your backup and lose more games anyways. This is probably about as good a time to go ahead and cut bait as possible. I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think the most surprising thing was that they kind of got rid of all of Rhule's guys as well and leaving Steve Wilkes as an interim head coach. So I thought that was kind of an interesting additional piece of this.
Yeah, it seems like they want somebody in charge who's done this before and maybe clear house of a little bit. There are the Rhule guys. You know, Phil Snow is a Rhule guy. He was just fired. Can't be based on the performance he had as the defensive coordinator of this team. It was the only redeeming part of who they were over the last couple of years. But I can understand just wanting to turn the page and give this to somebody who's been an NFL head coach before in Steve Wilkes. And now you have kind of an NFL-centric staff. They also fired their special teams coordinator. So they're clearly trying to clean house here.
Right.
I think the initial conversation point around this, and it's an understandable one, is that Matt Rhule is a college guy who completely rebuilt two college programs that needed to be rebuilt. And he did a great job of doing that. So if he can rebuild a college program, why can't he rebuild an NFL program? And why are we having this extended, ongoing conversation about why some of these guys who've succeeded at the college level just can't seem to figure it out in the NFL?
I think it's all like resource allocation, right? And I think that there is, and maybe, you don't want to ascribe too much to everybody, but in all of the failures, it seems to be a consistent line of not understanding how resource allocation truly has real world effects on the field with what you can and can't do. There is no such thing as just playing your backups, right? Or having replacement level players and being successful in the NFL. We don't have a point of reference in this league of teams succeeding year over year that way. If you don't have a true infrastructure, and you think about the best head coaches that have influence on the way that their personnel goes, whether it's Kyle Shanahan, you can look at that team year over year with him as a head coach and see a very clear idea of how they want to play offense and defense, not just in the plays that are called, but in the people that they bring into the building. You think about Andy Reid in two stints now between Philadelphia and Kansas City. And I'm using these shining examples to kind of paint the picture of what it looks like at its peak. On a baseline level, I need to be able to, if I am an ownership group, if I am a GM, whatever the case may be, I need to be able to see your vision based on your personnel and play calling week over week. I don't know if we've ever had a point where we could do that with Carolina while Matt Rhule has been here.
Especially on the offensive side. I think on defense,
right,
I can understand the contours of a plan.
Right.
Let's find these flexible athletes that are kind of positionless, and we're going to play this aggressive kind of pressure-filled style of defense, play a lot of weird zone behind it, and just be an oddity and a little bit of a difficult thing to prepare for on a week-to-week basis based on the players that we have. They did that on defense, and I think there were times where it looked really, really good, and over time it was fine. It was an acceptable way to approach that side of the ball. On offense, they just never, ever figured it out. They're cycling between Joe Brady and Ben McAdoo, and it's quarterback after quarterback, and they spent a ton of resources on the offensive line this year. It didn't really end up mattering. Christian McCaffrey was hurt, but even when Christian McCaffrey was playing, it doesn't really matter. They're the worst offense in the league, and if you can't figure out that side through multiple quarterbacks, multiple play callers, that's ultimately what's going to happen. If you're going to have a bottom five defense, you're going to get fired sooner rather than later, and that's exactly what took place. So now we get to this place where, all right, this team, it's kind of strangely assembled. Yes. You've given out a contract extension to DJ Moore. Shaq Thompson's on a pretty big contract extension. You really have no cap space next year based on the way that you've done this. You traded away some future resources to go get Matt Corral in this year's draft and then ultimately traded for Baker Mayfield to make him your starter anyway.
Right.
So I'm wondering, what is the plan from here? Beyond who the next head coach is going to be, we got a long, long time to figure that out. But the people that ultimately end up in charge, which direction do you want to take this thing? Let's play this out as a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. The Panthers end up as the worst team in the league this season, which I think is absolutely on the table. Right. They win 4 or 5 games. They have the number 1 pick in the draft. You have this team that has DJ Moore on it, that has Christian McCaffrey. You spent all these resources on the offensive line. You have players on defense that you think are kind of interesting. J.C. Horn, Brian Burns, who is going to be coming up for a contract extension here pretty soon. It's like, if we drop a cheap quarterback into this, if we almost stumble into a solution to our quarterback problem because we don't have any money and we have less resources than other teams, can we get there with the roster that's currently in place? I think there's an argument that it might be easier to go that direction than it is to go in the total teardown direction. The other big question, though, is who's doing this? Who's making these decisions?
Yes, I can see that. I don't hate that argument, right? And I think that you can look at both of those pathways kind of evenly, because for as painful as I think 2023 is going to be because of the lack of flexibility, outside of what you're going to have to do in terms of paying Brian Burns, you'll have some open doors in 2024 if you can kind of embrace the suck between the remainder of this year and all of next season, I'd imagine. So I think that if that's what you're looking at in terms of your short term, how do we patchwork this thing to get to that place in 2024 where the doors kind of open up for us in terms of spending that we can do, then I think that trying to get in a Geno Smith type of guy, not that he would be available, because I think that Seattle's very happy with him right now and would probably like to keep him around whenever they make a pivot at quarterback, if they decide to do so in the coming off seasons. If you can bring in a quarterback like that to just get you from point A to point B, that probably is a more viable direction in the immediate future than doing the teardown, because I don't even know where the teardown leaves you because of how weirdly they've spent their money and some of the holes that they still have on this roster. I was talking with a couple of my colleagues who were like, well, if you're Seattle or Baltimore, shouldn't you be calling about Brian Burns? And wouldn't you offer them some pretty decent draft capital for a guy like that? And the answer is yes, those teams should. I've just been kind of tortured with looking at it from Carolina's perspective. Like, what does that actually do for your franchise right this second? Do you think that you're one big draft away, after you clear your money? If you have a few, productive guys on rookie deals, especially if they play premium positions, does that change your outlook at all in the immediate future?
The Brian Burns thing, I think that would make sense to move on from someone like him just because you haven't paid him yet. He's going in the final year of his rookie deal next season.
Right, you're not
He's
eating
25 years old. Yeah, that's that one I get. But DJ Moore has been extended. Taylor Moton's been extended. Shaq Thompson's been extended. Christian McCaffrey. You've got Shaq Thompson is at $24.5 million next year. McCaffrey's at 20. Moton's at 24.5. DJ Moore's at 25. These are all contracts that are fairly fresh and new.
Yep.
So moving on from all of these deals, essentially after you've just paid the signing bonuses, that I feel like, what are you really accomplishing if you tear it all the way down? But again, the question is going to be, is Scott Fitterer the person who will oversee this? And what sort of autonomy does he have to make these sort of decisions here in the next 3 or 4 months as they move toward a new head coach? And if they decide to keep him and then hire the coach, and those two sides are misaligned again, then you're running into just another problem. So that's what they have to figure out, is that not just who the coach is going to be, but what is the organizational vision here? Because every 3 or 4 months, it changes. It's this is the shiny new quarterback. This is the shiny new quarterback. I don't like this. I'm going to go do that. That's how I make decisions.
Right.
I am not David Tepper, who owns an NFL franchise. And I feel like you can sense that. You get that feeling every time you see them make any sort of choice, is that they're willing to get off of it in 2 seconds. And sometimes that's a virtue, but not when you're trying to do the most important things involved in the NFL, picking quarterbacks, building around that quarterback, figuring out what your offensive identity is going to be. Right. So I think beyond the roster being torn down, I think the process has to be torn down and rebuilt. And I think in order to do that, you may have to clean house.
Which is why, and I'm glad you brought it here, because, for as disappointed as I was that Phil Snow was not retained, I think I like the messaging behind getting all of the Rhule guys out and having a
I
guy like
totally
Steve
understand why you
Wilks
do it.
to stand in, right? The messaging there is that we want adults here who have a vision, a clear vision of what it takes to succeed in the NFL, right? With true NFL bona fides is what I think they're going to be putting out in whatever candidates they end up interested in. It's going to be true NFL guys, if I had to guess, that have done this, that have maybe worked under guys who have built their rosters up a certain way because they believe in playing football a particular kind of way. And I think that that has to be the focus for a team that's in this kind of odd situation where all your young players are being paid right now, short of Brian Burns. To that point, you're not in any easy jump off, type of positions with a Christian McCaffrey, with the Shaq Thompson, with the DJ Moore. There's no easy way out for any of these types of contracts. So if you know that your young good guys are going to be paid, and it probably behooves you to just eat, the next couple of years on their contracts and hope to try to get as much production out of them as possible, then I think that the messaging in, hey, we're going to clear house, I'm interested to see what that means for Fitterer, in the personnel side of this thing. But I think that they're going to have to bring in a head coaching candidate who can walk in and say, at edge rusher, we're doing this. At cornerback, we're doing this. At quarterback, we're doing this. Offensively and defensively, here are my coordinators and my assistants, and we're going to play football this kind of way, full stop. That's where this franchise needs to be. Something that they had, I think, under Rivera when he had McDermott, and all those Eagles guys around, which was reflected in how they were competitive and successful in that Cam Newton era of Panthers ball. And since then, they've just been floundering. And you brought in a guy in Matt Rhule who, while building up college programs, I think never met the expectation of being a quote unquote culture builder, being that infrastructure builder. And this franchise now, I think, needs it more than ever because they have just struck out on quarterback after quarterback after quarterback. And this offensive line being in the hole that it's still in after addressing it however many ways they said that they've addressed it in the last couple of seasons.
My understanding about Carolina, or about Matt Rhule when he was at Baylor specifically, is that they just recruited all of these uber athletes that were kind of like taken from the island of misfit toys. Like they were incredible athletes, but it was about figuring out how to deploy them.
Right.
That's never going to be a strategy you can use in the NFL. The athletes are all on some sort of baseline level.
Right.
Like your advantages have to be schematic, or they have to be cultural, or they have to come through detail. It's not just about like, we can find this totally untapped resource and get the most out of it. That's just never going to be the way that it works. So I can understand why there's a gap between what he could accomplish at the college level and what he could accomplish at this level. And my thing is, when you're tearing down, you have to tear it down in order to get bad enough to rebuild it.
Yes.
They may not have to do that. They may be in such a bad way right now that even with some talent on the roster, they could be bad enough to put themselves in a position to draft a quarterback. And then can you really get this thing going again if you're a CJ Stroud in April and most of this roster stays intact? Because that's the concern that I had, is that they make two moves here. They cut Robbie Anderson, make one or two more cuts. They get $10 million in cap space. They get like $5 million in cap space for 2023.
Right.
If you have a rookie quarterback contract, even with a top 3 pick, you can easily fit that into whatever plan this is. Again, you stumble into a solution for the problem that you have created for yourself. So I'll be fascinated to see what they end up doing and what sort of moves end up happening. If I'm Ryan Poles, I am calling about DJ Moore yesterday, because 100%. This is a guy with $19 million base salary next year, 14, 15 the next 2 years. All the bonuses are already paid out. 25 years old. I'm trying to pick this corpse for whatever it has if I'm GMs around the NFL right now. Whether or not they want to do that, entirely different question. But they're going to have some real look yourself in the mirror conversations in Carolina about how this all goes next and how they can not run into the same problems they just ran into with the Matt Rhule era.
100%.